industry is slightly different to other forms of settler expansion in the sense that it was precipitated very specifically by the arrival of French Huguenots in the Cape in the 1680s. And the earliest white settlers who established freehold farms in the Cape, they established themselves as early as the 1650s, very shortly after the initial Dutch settlement, very shortly after Van Riebeeck settlement. And they established wheat farms and vegetable farms and later on, large cattle farms. But the wine industry was different in the sense that this was very much a French import, but very quickly expanded to take in other settlers. And the wine industry was established very specifically in the southwestern Cape, very close, by today's standards, very close to the initial settlement at Cape Town, or the city that becomes Cape Town, and then expands into the regions that we now today know as the Boerland or the Hottentot Holland. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, decided very early on that the predominant form of labor that would be used to establish agricultural farms would be imported slaves. In the southwestern Cape, especially on the wine farms and the wheat farms closest to Cape Town, slave labor predominated by quite a long way. Certainly indigenous laborers were used, and we often found Khoisan people, Khoi, or later Khoisan people, working side by side with imported slaves. But on the wine farms, the predominant form of labor was slave labor. The problem with indigenous labor is that or indigenous laborers are very hard to domesticate, in a sense, or very hard to control. Indigenous peoples have knowledge of the environment. They have access to a hinterland beyond the colonial settlement. They have access to peoples beyond the colonial settlement. So it's relatively easy for indigenous people to escape the confines of colonial control. And the Dutch East India Company was very concerned to limit the extent of indigenous aggression. Our historical sources are in fact incredibly rich, certainly compared to other European colonial settlements. The Dutch East India Company left a marvelous record of its colonial settlement. These records are all found in the National Archives in Cape Town. Some records are found in the National Archives in the Netherlands, the Dutch Rijksarchief. One of the biggest sources is what is known as the Opgave. This was an annual census taken by Dutch colonial officials, and these records listed, essentially they were tax records, so they listed property and they listed property ownership, including the number of slaves that every single white settler in the colony owned. They're certainly good enough to give us a broad picture of the nature and distribution and sort of levels of slave ownership amongst white settlers in the colony. The other fantastic record, that set of records that we have, are criminal records, and these exist at several levels of sort of judicial hierarchy. The way historians have used them was to show kinds of resistance of slaves, or what the Dutch, of course, called crime, criminal actions. Not only do they tell us about the kinds of resistance, but they tell us a great deal about the everyday lives of slaves. They said a whole lot about everyday life, about their personal circumstances, about their relationships, about their wives, husbands, children, and so forth, about their patterns of movement from one farm to the next, about where they slept, about where they drank, where they ate, and all these sorts of things. So we can tell a whole lot about daily life just by studying these criminal records. Lower down the judicial hierarchy, we'd also have magistrates' courts, so lower courts. The best thing about the criminal records is that they are the closest thing that we have to hearing the slaves speak in their own voices, hearing the slaves speak for themselves. In addition to those records, we also have kind of civil records. Disputes between white settlers, predominantly, sort of neighborly disputes about access to rivers, about water courses, boundary disputes, all these sorts of things, debt disputes about, white settlers quite often loaned each other money, and in cases of non-payment, they'd pursue each other in court, and these kinds of records again tell us a great deal about relationships between white settlers. We have a very, very big set of testamentary records, so records of inheritance. We don't really so much have death certificates for slaves, or very few in number relative to white settlers, but occasionally we have death certificates of slaves or descendants of slaves. And death certificates, of course, they don't just tell us about place and time of death, but they tell us about people's relationships, who your father was, who your mother was, and so forth. So it's possible to use these kinds of records to construct sort of genealogical tables or genealogical trajectories. Genealogical research in South Africa was around sort of white families, but a few historians very limited number of historians have begun to try to construct family trees, genealogical records for slaves, and in some cases, in very sort of limited number of cases, of Khoisan. So, to sum up, what do people do? Large numbers of people go to Cape Town, large numbers of people go to mission stations, and a significant proportion of people remain almost entirely tied to the old slave agricultural economy, but not in a way that was simply a reproduction of that economy. The day of emancipation, most people sought to leave their farms almost immediately. We had two emancipations in the Cape. The first one was formal emancipation, which came in December 1834, was succeeded by a period of what British colonial officials called apprenticeship. A real emancipation for the Cape Colony slaves really only came on the 1st of December 1838. The problem for the Cape's slaves is that they didn't have very many options. We have to remember that, of course, slaves left their enslavement largely empty-handed. Very few had any savings of any kind. And so in order to subsist, in order to stay alive, slaves had to continue, or former slaves had to continue to work in some form or other. A large number of slaves moved into Cape Town from the countryside. What do people do in Cape Town? In Cape Town, their options are limited, but one big advantage that slaves in Cape Town have is that they have access to various networks, family networks, networks of friendship, or similar kinds of relationships that were established during slavery. But slaves had established all kinds of relationships, partnerships, sexual relationships, family relationships with the free black population. So having those relationships, I think, enabled people to establish themselves in Cape Town. Certainly one thing it did is that it enabled people to find accommodation, to find housing of some kind. The big challenge for slaves who made their way from the countryside into the city was to find housing. And in fact, the sort of housing crisis that Cape Town experiences today has its origins in this period, in this moment, with sort of large numbers of people coming from the countryside, not having adequate accommodation, and being forced into very crowded, cramped conditions. What kinds of work do they do? All manner of things. Fishing was a significant sort of occupation. Construction work was a significant occupation, or significant numbers of people were engaged in construction work as masons, as plasterers, bricklayers. Large numbers of people become sort of petty traders, hawkers, street hawkers, selling all manner of things, fresh produce, fruit, vegetables, and so forth. Some people are able to establish themselves as independent producers on plots of land on the outskirts of the city, on what is today known as the Cape Flats. By the 1870s, so 3 decades or so after emancipation, we begin to see the emergence of a professional class. People like, teachers, especially ministers of religion, especially, emerge as a sort of elite. The vast bulk of people, however, remain as largely as sort of impoverished labourers, working what we would now call at sort of working class occupations, living largely a sort of hand-to-mouth existence. If we go to the countryside, the one obvious option was to go back to agricultural work. The second option was for people to, and this is a very important, significant option, which was for people to establish themselves on mission stations. And a large number of people, several thousand people, sort of freed slaves, moved to mission stations. Well, we don't know the exact numbers, but anything between 8,000 and 10,000 people. Missionaries encourage former slaves to establish themselves as independent sort of gardeners, market gardeners. Probably the majority of people who go to mission stations end up working on white-owned farms, at least for part of the year, and certainly at the busy times of the agricultural cycles. People needed to earn an income, needed to subsist, but they're able to do so in a way that is very different from the days of slavery. They go, if not entirely on their own terms, certainly partly on their own terms. So what we effectively have is a labour force that has one foot in the old slave economy, the agricultural economy, and one foot as independent producers on mission stations. The third sort of category of people are people who don't go to Cape Town, people who don't establish themselves on mission stations, but people who by and large continue to work on white-owned farms more or less exclusively. Now, our research tells us that very few people simply remained on the farms on which they lived as slaves. The most significant development that we see after the ending of slavery is that there's a great deal of mobility amongst the agricultural population. People are able to move from one farm to another. If they get fed up with one employer, they simply go to another. If they don't like the wages, they can go to the next farmer and demand wages. If they don't like that farm, they could go and live on a mission station for at least part of the time. When the British arrive at the beginning of the 19th century, they are keen to modernize the economy, or to transform the Cape economy and society. And they introduce quite a number of changes, quite radical ones, and ones that have significant consequences for the colony. Of course, the point to recognize is that Britain is by far at this time, beginning of the 19th century, of course, is by far the leading industrial and colonial power, naval power in the world. And so the changes that they introduce at the Cape are part of a global process. The first most significant development, of course, is the ending of the slave trade. So Britain finally conquers the colony in 1806. They have two periods of occupation, the first in 1795, but the second important permanent one is 1806. And almost immediately after the second British occupation, they end the slave trade. So what we have is a situation where the wine economy is expanding, but the slave population is shrinking or contracting, or at best remaining stagnant. So you have wine farmers essentially keen to get wine production up and get as much out of their slave population. The consequence for slaves, of course, is that they are that the demands being placed upon them are greatly increased, and certainly the evidence that we have suggests that slaves resist these demands, and slavery becomes a whole lot more fractious. For the first time now, we see the slave population being able to reproduce itself. This is not a feature of the slave population that we see during Dutch rule. The British are very keen to ameliorate or to improve the conditions of slaves, and they introduce a number of changes to give slaves better well-being, to allow slaves to marry, and to limit the punishment that slaves can be subjected to. As far as the indigenous population is concerned, so the Khoisan population, Britain is as keen to change the relations there. Of course, Khoisan labour was predominantly used in the Eastern Cape, and Britain is very keen to ameliorate or to limit the violence to which indigenous labourers on the colony's frontier, especially the Eastern Cape frontier, but also the northern frontier, to which indigenous labourers are subjected. This is known as the sort of Caledon Code, but as far as the Khoisan are concerned, the Caledon Code immobilizes them. It turns them into, as far as the Khoisan are concerned, it turns them into sort of near slaves or serfs, but it effectively ties them down to individual farms, it ties them down to white settlers. So Ordinance 50 of 1828 is a precursor to a broader process of emancipation. Ordinance 50 of 1828 is effectively the emancipation of the Khoi, or emancipation of the Khoisan, and it frees Khoisan people from the kinds of restrictions to which they were previously subjected. So they are free to seek their own employers. They are not tied down in the same way that they were tied down by the 1809 legislation. They are, to all intents and purposes, in legal terms at least, of course not in real terms, not in practical terms, but de jure, they are, to all intents and purposes, they are the equals, in legal terms, they are the equals of white settlers. And then, of course, following on from that, the next big piece of legislation was the freeing of slaves. Emancipation, formal emancipation in 1834, but then the real emancipation after a 4-year period of apprenticeship in 1838. And this, completely transforms the Cape. It liberalizes the economy. It frees people from bondage and from all kinds of restrictions. These British interventions hugely upset white settlers, but the final upshot of British intervention is the large-scale migration of white farmers, of white settlers out of the colony. In later years, Afrikaner nationalists call this migration the Great Trek. It's not known as the Great Trek at this particular moment. It becomes known as the Great Trek in later decades, but it leads to the sort of, to the vast sort of expansion of white settlers into other regions of what becomes South Africa. These migrations and ultimate sort of conquest of the South African interior comes as a consequence of British intervention.